Her son gave a speech about legacy while she sat behind the kitchen island, eating soup from a can. Irene Whittaker didn't interrupt, didn't raise her voice. By sundown she'd frozen the estate, flipped the deed, and erased his blueprint with a notarized signature. She wasn't the guest at the table anymore, she was the foundation under it. They built around her silence for years. Now they'd learn what happened when the silence signed its name in ink. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Irene Whittaker stood at the front steps of the farmhouse she had polished, painted, and preserved for nearly half a century. The late afternoon sky over rural Ohio was brushed with the burnt orange of dying leaves and soft gray clouds. But inside the house, laughter and the faint clink of wine glasses filtered through the old windows like a scene from a life she used to live. The door swung open. Madeline wore a silk blouse, the color of champagne, and a smile stretched just enough to be polite. "Oh good, you made it," she said, stepping aside without a hug. The smell of roasted turkey and sage-heavy stuffing curled out into the chilly air. Irene stepped inside. "I brought my sweet potato pie." Oh, Madeline blinked, then reached for it like it was a handoff in a business deal. "We weren't sure what you'd eat," so she motioned toward the kitchen counter. "We heated up some soup for you. Low-sodium vegetable. It's safe." On the counter sat a small bowl beside a dented can with the label half peeled. Lukewarm steam rose lazily. Irene blinked once, then looked past Madeline into the dining room, where the oak table, the one her late sister built from reclaimed barnwood, was dressed in cream linens and glimmering candlelight. Ethan sat at the head, raising a glass of Pinot to the circle of well-groomed friends, neighbors and business partners who filled every seat. She wasn't one of them. "You can sit there," Madeline said, gesturing to a bar stool tucked against the cold marble island. "Just easier with all the seating already set." Ethan's voice carried, "To legacy, land and vision. This house has been in the Whittaker name since before any of us were born, and with our plans it'll finally step into the future." A polite cheer. Glasses clinked. Irene sank onto the stool, her back to the family table, fingers folding tightly in her lap. She didn't touch the soup. Her stomach, a coil of silence, had no appetite. Behind her someone approached, a whisper-soft step. Sophie, 18 and Ray, with charcoal smudges on her sleeves, set a biscuit beside the bowl. "This wasn't right," she said, barely audible, eyes flicking nervously toward her parents. "I'm sorry." Irene smiled at her, small, grateful. "It's all right, honey. You're here." The light above her buzzed faintly. The distant scrape of a carving knife, the low hum of conversation, the clatter of forks, it all blurred around her. But the table didn't. That table. Her sister Camille had sanded it by hand. They'd shared every Whittaker Thanksgiving around it for decades. Now she sat with her back to it, a guest in her own life. She quietly reached into her coat pocket, fingers brushing against a familiar texture. No, not yet. The evening dulled into indifference. No one asked her to stay for pie. Outside, frost ghosted across the windshield of her aging Toyota. Irene sat in the driver's seat, engine still off, interior dim. Her reflection in the rearview mirror was soft and steady, a face lined not by bitterness, but by miles traveled alone. She opened the glove compartment. Inside, a sealed envelope. Aged ivory, the kind Dan Coulter always used for important documents. On the front, in her handwriting, were 5 words written months ago with a fountain pen. Dan, in case of injustice. Her hand hovered over it. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled. This house, this family. Her whole life had lived in its beams, its floorboards, its worn staircase banister, the one Ethan used to slide down in tube socks. She had paid the taxes when her son was too broke to help. She had cared for Camille through 6 years of cancer in these walls. And now, they offered her a stool, a can, and silence. Not anymore. She took the envelope, set it on the passenger seat, and placed both hands on the steering wheel, like she was preparing for something long overdue. Her voice, barely a murmur, filled the car's quiet. Let's see who remembers the rules. Then she turned the key, headlights cutting through the dark, as she drove toward the one man who never forgot whose house this really was. Frost still clung to the grass like a warning as Irene eased her car up the gravel driveway of Dan Coulter's weathered ranch. The headlights cut across the cracked driveway sign. Coulter and Sons, Estate Law, retired but sharp. She shut the engine off and sat for a moment, the sealed envelope on her lap like a lit fuse. The sun hadn't fully risen. A crow cawed overhead, then silence. She knocked twice on the storm door. A few seconds later, it creaked open. Dan, in a flannel robe and house shoes, squinted at her. "You're early. You're awake." He opened the door wider, the smell of black coffee and old books spilling out. "You bring me trouble, or triumph." "Little of both." She stepped inside, placed the envelope on the dining room table. "I need you to read this first." Dan slid into a chair, peeled the flap open with the edge of a butter knife. His reading glasses hung around his neck, but he didn't put them on until halfway through the first page. Then he stopped reading altogether, and just stared. "This," he began, then caught himself. "Irene, this wasn't part of what Ethan filed with the court last April." Her eyes held. "Because he filed it behind my back." Dan leaned back, tapping the corner of the document against the table. "You added Sophie as co-beneficiary. You reinstated your authority. This codicil is dated 2 weeks before Camille passed. I had it notarized, quietly, just in case. Does he know this exists? I doubt he remembers. I still have a memory." Dan whistled low through his teeth. "You realize if this holds, it overrides his filed copy. That's the idea." They sat in silence. Through the window, the dawn lit up the maple tree in Dan's front yard, leaves red as a fire not yet out. Irene wrapped her fingers around the mug he'd handed her, letting the heat seep in. "I need proof of notarization," he said finally. "Marge found a box last winter in her attic. Camille stored documents there. We didn't touch it back then, but I think the logbook's in it." Dan stood, already grabbing his keys. "Get your coat." Marge Dean's house smelled like peppermint oil and lemon polish, the scent of someone who still believed in scrubbing life down to the bone. The attic ladder groaned as Dan climbed it, flashlight bouncing against the beams. "I'm telling you, it's one of those beige banker's boxes," Marge called up from below. "Camille made labels with that red label gun. Fancy handwriting too. Found it," Dan called down after a minute. "Legal logs. Camille W." He came back down holding it like an artifact. Inside, old notary seals, tax papers, and halfway through, a spiral ledger wrapped in wax paper. Dan flipped it open, his finger scanning the pages until it stopped. April 12th. Camille Whitaker. Witnessed signature. Codicil verified. He exhaled hard. "This isn't just valid. It's strong." Marge handed Irene a cup of her homemade tea. "You waited long enough," she said. "Time to flip the lights back on." Dan closed the box. "Let me draft a protective order. If Ethan gets even a whiff that this is in motion, he'll move fast. We'll need to move faster." "I'm ready," Irene said. "No, you're steady," he corrected. "That's better." He paused at the door, hand on the knob. "You want to wait on Sophie? Tell her first." Irene shook her head. "No, she'll know when it's real." Dan studied her for a long moment, then gave one sharp nod. "Let's freeze the whole damn thing before they get clever." The farmhouse porch had been power washed, strung with burlap bunting, and accented with copper planters, all of it arranged like the front cover of a lifestyle magazine. Irene parked 3 houses down and walked the rest of the way. Her boots crunched over early autumn leaves, the wind carrying the sharp tang of rosemary and lemon from some artisan brunch platter. From inside, voices rang bright and shallow. "By next spring we'll have the barn converted into an event space," Madeline's voice said. "Sustainability meets sophistication. That's the theme." Polite laughs followed. Champagne flutes clinked. Irene stepped onto the porch. She didn't knock. The door creaked as she opened it, letting in a gust of cold air. She stepped into the foyer like someone who still remembered the exact sound the floorboards made under real family feet. Heads turned. Polished men in pressed sweaters, women in muted pastels, one realtor, two local business owners, a planning commissioner, all crowded around a table covered in renderings and mock-ups of the Whitaker land reimagined, paved driveways, a greenhouse cafe, and a minimalist guest house in place of Camille's old garden shed. Ethan's jaw tightened, but his smile never cracked. "Mom, you didn't RSVP. I didn't come to eat." She held up a manila envelope, thick, sealed and folded. "Just so, this is for you." Madeline looked like she smelled something burning. "What is that?" Irene placed the envelope on top of a mock-up labeled "The Whitaker Legacy Experience." "Correction," she said. "To your blueprint." Sophie, standing by the mantel in a plain black turtleneck and paint-stained jeans, looked up. Their eyes met across the room, and for just a moment, the tension fractured, not with fear, but something else. Alignment. Irene turned and walked out without another word. By 3:17 p.m., Dan Coulter had filed the estate freeze motion with the Franklin County Courthouse. At 4:06, it was stamped, approved, and entered into the digital docket. By 5:12, he and Marge were standing by the mailbox, watching as a junior deputy pinned a laminated copy of the freeze order to the farmhouse door, right below the engraved "Welcome to the Whitakers" plaque Madeline had ordered last year. "Not bad for a morning's work," Dan muttered, adjusting his scarf. Marge handed him a thermos of cider. "It's what I call a quiet strike," she said. Eyes locked on the house. No noise, no drama, just a fact nailed to the front of their little fantasy. Inside, the lights still glowed warm behind sheer curtains, but no one had stepped out. Not yet. Irene stood in the shadows by the edge of the property, just beyond the walnut tree Camille had loved. The freeze order fluttered lightly in the wind. It made no sound, but it said everything. Her fingers were steady at her sides, gloved in soft leather gripping nothing. Her seat at their table was gone, but she didn't come for the seat. She came for the foundation. And she had it. Inside the house, Ethan finally pulled back the curtain and looked out. His eyes landed on the notice, his mouth opened slightly, then shut. Madeline came up behind him. "What is that?" she asked. His voice, quiet and low, barely covered the tremble. It's a freeze order." Madeline blinked. "On what?" "On the whole damn estate." The wind snapped brittle leaves against the farmhouse windows as Irene turned the old brass key in the door. It still stuck the way it always had. A little twist right, slight lift of the handle, then push. Some locks remember you, even when people pretend to forget. The house was quiet. Too quiet for a holiday week. Ethan's Tesla was gone. So was Madeline's Mercedes. Sophie's bicycle, though, was leaned against the garage like a whispered promise. Someone still lived here with a soul. Irene stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She hadn't crossed the threshold since the freeze order was posted. And now the place didn't smell like a home. It smelled like lemon floor cleaner, lavender plug-ins, and artificial polish. All gloss, no memory. She moved slowly through the front hall. It hit her almost immediately. The photo wall, once a collage of decades, Camille in bell-bottoms, Irene in librarian cardigans, Ethan as a toddler in muddy boots, Sophie covered in finger paint, was stripped bare. Only polished nail holes and faint outlines remained. Gone. The frames, the faces, the history. Her throat tightened. She stepped closer, brushing a finger over a faded square where a picture of Camille holding Sophie as a baby used to hang. Gone, but not forgotten, just erased. She made her way upstairs. The carpet had been steam cleaned within an inch of its life, the air unnaturally still. She opened Sophie's bedroom door gently. The walls still had charcoal sketches pinned up, Sophie's hand unmistakable in its line work. One was of the walnut tree. Another Camille's silhouette at the stove, face turned just out of view. Irene moved toward the bookshelf. A thick hardback, titled "Women Who Built the Midwest," stuck out at a crooked angle. Something peeked from inside. She pulled it free. Tucked between pages was a photograph. Camille and Irene in their 20s, sitting on the farmhouse porch with lemonade glasses and paintbrushes. Camille's laugh frozen mid-burst, Irene's brow sun-kissed and furrowed, like always. In the background, a 5-year-old Ethan played in the dirt with a toy dump truck. Sophie had hidden it, preserved it. Irene smiled quietly, a smile full of steel and ache. She carried the photo downstairs, found a spare hook in the hallway near the laundry room, a spot overlooked, but still visible. She hung it there with care, straightening it twice. It clicked into place with a soft but final sound. An hour later her phone buzzed. A text from Madeline. "Please stop invading the space. It's unsettling." Irene stared at the message for a full minute. Then she typed, slowly and clearly. "Then stop erasing the people who built it." No response came. She sat on the couch. The same couch she helped reupholster in 1993, when Camille decided florals were back in style. Her fingertips grazed the fabric. Faint pilling, a few worn patches. It held stories, just not ones Madeline cared to tell. Irene didn't cry. She'd done her mourning years ago. What remained now was colder, cleaner, like a sharpened blade. A knock at the door startled her. Not a neighbor. A courier. He held out a white envelope stamped in legal gray. She signed without a word, and closed the door behind her. The letter inside was typed in careful, clipped phrasing. "Our clients are prepared to contest your recent filings. Continued access to the property may complicate ongoing legal proceedings. We advise amicable resolution to avoid escalation." Beneath it, a scribble of a signature and a firm name she didn't recognize. One Ethan surely paid too much for. Irene folded the letter once and slid it into the drawer beneath Camille's old recipe box. She didn't need a lawyer to remind her how escalation worked. She'd been escalating quietly since Thanksgiving. And now the gloves were off. Not thrown, not flung, but folded and placed neatly aside. The photo stayed on the wall. Ethan Whitaker adjusted his cufflinks like a man headed to accept an award. Madeline walked 2 steps behind him, high heels clicking with curated grace, a soft camel coat draped over her arm. They moved through the courthouse lobby like they owned the marble beneath their feet. They didn't see Irene step in behind them, slow and steady, her worn black purse tucked under her arm. Dan Coulter flanking her with a slim briefcase that looked deceptively unimportant. Courtroom 3C smelled like old wood polish and tension. A thin line of fluorescent light buzzed overhead as the bailiff called the case number. Ethan leaned toward Madeline and whispered something smug. She smiled. Tight, rehearsed, practiced. They didn't see what was coming. Irene settled into the front row, back straight, hands folded. Dan stood to her right, calm as ever. His papers were already sorted into labeled tabs. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "We're here today to address a dispute of estate succession regarding the late Camille Whitaker's property and assets." Ethan stood first. "Your Honor, I'm the only living child of the deceased sister. My mother has been living on the property, yes, but without legal stake. The will as filed." "Filed by you," Dan interjected politely, standing without being prompted, and notably missing a legally notarized codicil. The judge lifted a brow. "Mr. Coulter, you have something to present." "I do, Your Honor." Dan opened his folder with quiet precision and produced 3 items: a signed codicil naming Irene Whitaker and Sophie Whitaker as co-beneficiaries, a notarization log from April of last year bearing Camille's official notary seal, and a notarized witness statement. This document was prepared under Camille Whitaker's direction, notarized in accordance with Ohio law, and properly archived. Ethan took a sharp breath. This wasn't part of the original will. "Because," Irene said, rising slowly, "you filed the will behind my back." The judge leaned forward. "Miss Whitaker, do you have supporting documentation for any claims of active estate management?" "I do." She handed over a second folder. Inside 8 years of receipts, bank statements and property tax payments, all in her name. Dan added, "She's been maintaining the land, funding essential repairs, and partially funding her granddaughter's education. Her involvement was never symbolic. Madeline whispered too loudly, "This is ridiculous. She's just bitter we made the house more presentable." Irene didn't even blink. "You made it vacant." The judge held up a hand. "Let's keep the commentary off the record." She flipped through the documents. These taxes were paid consistently. Dan nodded. "Auto pay from Miss Whitaker's account since 2015. Verified." The judge looked at Ethan. "You filed none of this." "I wasn't aware she'd made changes. You're the sole heir." "I believed I was." From the gallery, a door clicked open. Sophie entered, quietly but deliberately. She wore all black, her sketch pad in one hand. She walked past Ethan, without even glancing at him, and sat beside Irene, placing her hand over her grandmother's, without a word. A beat passed. The judge studied them all, then closed the folder. "Mr. Whitaker," she said to Ethan, "you are not the sole heir. Not anymore." Ethan's face drained of color. Madeline hissed toward Irene, "You planned this." Irene turned her head just enough. "No," she said softly. "I just remembered." The gavel came down, one solid strike. "This court grants Miss Irene Whitaker temporary estate control pending full trust review. All prior renovation or business plans are to be suspended until further ruling." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. Sophie leaned in and whispered to Irene, "You didn't blink once." "I didn't need to," she murmured. Dan slipped the judge's stamped ruling into his briefcase. "Let them grin all they want," he said under his breath. "You've got the keys now." And for the first time since Camille's funeral, Irene let herself breathe. Irene stepped into her old bedroom, and for a moment it didn't feel like hers at all. The curtains were gone. The cherrywood dresser where she used to keep Camille's letters had been replaced with an empty IKEA frame. The walls were bare, scuffed where pictures had once hung. Even the mattress had changed, newer, firmer, soulless. A white tag still flapped from the side, like a smug signature of erasure. In the closet, plastic bins labeled guest bedding sat stacked like a silent eviction notice. One had her handwriting still faintly visible beneath Madeline's marker. "Winter linens, keep." The marker didn't hide it well. History leaves shadows. She didn't blink. She didn't sigh. She set down the canvas duffel she'd packed carefully the night before and unzipped it with the calm of someone not returning but reclaiming. Out came fresh white sheets, crisp and sun-dried. A reading lamp she'd owned since the Reagan administration. A tin box of lavender sachets. And last, Camille's quilt, hand-stitched with stars and pine trees, a patchwork of memory and resolve. She unfolded it slowly, laid it across the bed, and smoothed the corners with both hands. Downstairs she heard the front door creak open. "Back here," she called. Marge appeared in the doorway with a plastic bucket in one hand and a bottle of vinegar cleaner in the other. "Well, well," she said, taking in the room. "Looks like you walked in with more than a toothbrush." Irene smiled faintly. "They emptied it. I'm filling it." They got to work. Marge knelt with a rag and began scrubbing the baseboards, muttering something about Madeline's obsession with minimalist decor being an assault on warmth. Irene dusted, polished, hung up a small framed photo of Camille from 1976, laughing with a hammer in one hand and paint on her cheek. They played Patsy Cline from a tinny Bluetooth speaker Marge had brought. The room hummed with an old kind of comfort, stubborn, scented with lemon and history. By late afternoon, the light had softened, stretching long shadows across the hardwood floor. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her cheeks pink from the wind, sketch pad tucked under one arm, and a mason jar full of marigolds in the other. "I figured you'd be in here." Irene turned. "Come in." Sophie placed the jar on the windowsill. "There was nothing left in this room. I thought maybe they were converting it into a walk-in closet." Irene glanced at the quilt. "It remembers." Sophie handed her a drawing, a rough pencil sketch of the hallway with the missing photo, now redrawn with Irene and Camille laughing beneath the walnut tree. Irene took it silently, and nodded once. It was perfect. The front door slammed. Then sharp footsteps. Heavy. Fast. Ethan. He burst into the room like a thunderclap in a chapel. What the hell is this? Irene didn't flinch. She stood by the bed, arms folded, eyes level. It's called living where I've always belonged. You don't get to just move back in. His voice cracked, anger cut with panic. This isn't finished, you know that. Then check the front door. He blinked. What? Go check it. Ethan hesitated, then stormed out. A beat passed, then a yell echoed from downstairs. You posted this. Irene calmly sat on the bed. Legal occupancy notice, she said to Marge. County approved. Sophie grinned behind her sketch pad. Footsteps stomped away. The door slammed again. Tires peeled down the gravel drive seconds later. Marge wiped her hands on a rag. I like when they leave angry. They always do, Irene murmured, when the paperwork's not in their favor. The next morning, Irene opened her email. Subject immediate legal action. Cease and desist from Whitaker and Dreller LLP. Counsel for Ethan and Madeline Whitaker. She clicked it open. The language was polite, the tone condescending, the intent hostile. They wanted her out. Again, Dan placed the manila folder on the table, like it weighed more than paper ever should. The room inside the courthouse annex was narrow and windowless, filled with the sterile scent of lemon disinfectant and processed coffee. Irene sat straight-backed beside him, wearing a gray wool cardigan, her purse resting at her feet. Across from her, Ethan leaned back with his arms crossed. Madeline scrolled her phone with polished nails, not even pretending to pay attention, until Dan flipped the folder open. These, he said, tapping the stack with a single finger, are copies of every tax payment, insurance premium, and emergency repair invoice tied to the Whitaker property since 2015, all paid from Miss Whitaker's personal account. Madeline didn't look up. She lived there. That's not contribution, that's occupancy. Dan smiled without warmth. Is it occupancy if the roof repair came out of her pension, or if she covered winterization costs, while Ethan was in Boca Raton? Ethan sat forward, bristling. She's never told me about any of this. Irene spoke, quiet but unwavering. I wasn't asked. Dan continued. This spreadsheet, he slid it across the table toward the judge's clerk, details every cent Irene invested in upkeep over the last 8 years. It totals just under $97,000. That's not symbolic effort. That's stewardship. Silence ticked by like a metronome. Madeline narrowed her eyes. This feels conveniently prepared. Dan raised a brow. Being organized isn't a crime. It's usually how older women stay unbulldozed. Ethan turned to Irene, his voice laced with disbelief. Why didn't you ever say anything? Because I wasn't trying to impress anyone, she said. I was trying to keep the place from falling apart. The judge didn't speak yet. She was studying the receipts, stamped, labeled, color-coded, like they revealed more than dollar signs. And they did. They told the story of a woman who fixed leaking pipes at midnight, who paid insurance premiums instead of booking vacations, who signed checks quietly, while the world forgot she had accounts at all. Dan opened one more file, this one thinner. Your Honor, he said. There's one more disclosure to include for the record. He slid a document across. It was a 529 college savings account summary. Madeline looked up. What is that? Sophie's tuition fund, Dan said. Irene opened it on Sophie's 5th birthday. She's contributed every month since, even when no one else did. Ethan's expression flickered. Just for a second. That fund was supposed to be from you. Irene cut in. I made sure it stayed real whether or not you remembered. Sophie sat on the bench behind them, hands in her lap, head bowed slightly. But now she looked up, cheeks warm, eyes glistening with something fierce. You're why I didn't give up on art school, she whispered. Marge, from her spot in the gallery, leaned forward and whispered to no one in particular. She didn't just show up. She held the roof up. The judge finally spoke. All these documents will be admitted for consideration. Miss Whitaker, your financial stewardship will weigh heavily in my final determination. Ethan started to say something, but the judge raised a hand. Save it for closing remarks. The gavel didn't fall, but the tone did. Dan packed the folders back into his case with deliberate precision. Outside the room, fluorescent lights buzzed low and dull. Irene stood slowly, gathered her purse, and walked out without acknowledging Ethan or Madeline. As they reached the elevator, the judge's clerk caught up to them. "The final ruling's been scheduled," she said. "Next week." "Good," Irene said. The elevator dinged open. She stepped inside and looked straight ahead. "Let's end it where it should have ended years ago." The farmhouse porch groaned beneath boots that had once carried hay bales, not handshakes. Irene stood barefoot in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to the elbows, apron dusted with flour and sunlight. The scent of pot roast and baked apples drifted out through the screen door like a welcome that hadn't been offered in years. Steam fogged the kitchen window in soft curls, and beneath Patsy Cline on the radio you could hear real voices, laughing, swapping stories, remembering. She'd filled the long pine table with people who remembered the land before it was called Potential. The Garzas, who had plowed the lower fields in the 80s. Florence Dubois, who used to babysit Ethan during harvest. Leonard Avery, retired plumber and amateur poet, who'd installed the original septic tank and never let anyone forget it. Back then, Irene said as she set down a pitcher of sweet tea, this place wasn't a brand, it was a backbone. They were gathered around mismatched chairs and old quilts draped over benches. Nothing matched, but nothing needed to. Sophie sat at the end with a sketch pad on her knees, head bent in quiet focus, charcoal dust painting her fingertips. "You remember the summer Camille locked herself out and had to climb through the second-floor window in church shoes?" Irene asked. Laughter erupted. Even Leonard chuckled until he coughed. Sophie looked up, smiling. Really smiling, for the first time in days. "What color were the shoes?" she asked. "Eggplant," Irene replied without hesitation. "And 2 sizes too small. She bought 'em for Easter, refused to admit they hurt." Marge leaned in from across the table. "This right here, this is what you call a gathering, not a brunch with flatware and focus groups." Dan Coulter stood off to the side, observing like a quiet juror. He'd already filed the necessary paperwork that morning, a report outlining the cultural and community value of the Whitaker property, complete with names, testimonies, and photos. A quiet legal weapon disguised as a potluck. On the edge of the field, a black SUV idled. Inside, Madeline adjusted her sunglasses and snapped a photo through the windshield. Ethan sat beside her, scrolling. He posted a cryptic message to his socials. "Some people just love unnecessary drama." No names, but the bitterness was loud. Madeline, despite herself, stepped out in heels that sank into the soil with every step. She walked up the gravel path but never crossed the threshold. From the yard, she saw the faces at the table. Not her friends, not her audience. No one turned. She stood there for 15 seconds before retreating back to the car. Inside the kitchen, Irene poured coffee into mismatched mugs, sliding one to Florence, who nodded thanks. The air smelled like peach cobbler and wood polish. Old ceiling fans turned slow above their heads. No photographers, no catered trays, no staged smiles, just history being remembered by the ones who helped make it. Dan glanced down at his phone, then at Irene. "You'll want to see this." She wiped her hands on a towel, accepted the screen. The county assessor's office had posted a public update to the property registry. Primary owner of record, Whitaker Irene C. effective immediately. She didn't say anything, not out loud. But she did sit down, not with her back straight and guarded, but with shoulders relaxed, hands open on the table, like a woman who no longer had to brace for what came next. Sophie glanced up, sensing the shift. "Is it real now?" Irene met her eyes. "It's always been real. But now it's recorded." Out at the tree line, the SUV was gone, and no one missed it. The gavel didn't just strike wood. It cracked open a chapter. Judge Merriman's voice echoed through the courtroom with the finality of concrete setting. "The court recognizes the submitted codicil as legally binding. Primary estate control is granted to Irene Whitaker, with succession structure amended to include her granddaughter Sophie Whitaker as heir apparent. Dan didn't smile. He simply closed his folder and nodded, like the truth had finally caught up with the paperwork. Irene sat with her spine straight, hands folded tightly in her lap. The light above flickered once, fluorescent and unflattering, but she glowed beneath it anyway. Not because the room gave her dignity, because she'd never let go of it in the first place. Across the aisle, Ethan looked like someone had emptied the world of sound. He leaned back slowly, jaw tight, staring at the judge like she'd just announced the farmhouse had burned to the ground. Madeline didn't speak. She opened her bag, pulled out a tablet, and began typing furiously. "Let the record reflect," the judge continued, "that Mr. Whitaker retains no legal claim over the property. Sentimental standing does not override codified ownership." Madeline stood abruptly. "We're filing a public protest." "You can't possibly." The judge didn't look up. "You're welcome to file what you like. Whether it survives the hour is another matter." It didn't. By the time Irene walked out into the crisp Ohio air, the county clerk had already denied the protest. Filed with no standing, the rejection email read, "Attempted interference in certified estate matter." Dan handed her a printout just to be sure. "Still want to check your inbox?" he asked with a dry grin. "No," Irene said. "I want to check the mailbox." That afternoon, the sun was high and gold, when Sophie knelt beside the old wooden post at the end of the gravel drive. The previous mailbox sat tilted, rusted at the hinge, still faintly marked with E. Whitaker, in peeling sticker letters. Irene stood beside her, holding the new one. Black metal, clean lines, a red flag sharp as a declaration. Sophie pulled a cordless drill from her tote. "You ready?" she asked. "Ready?" Sophie screwed the plate into place, one bolt at a time. When she was done, she stepped back, wiping her hands on her jeans. The nameplate gleamed in the sun. "Whitaker, Irene," just like it always should have read. Irene reached out, ran her fingers across the letters. "Funny," she murmured. "He always talked about legacy, but I actually wrote one." Back inside, Dan laid out the final deed on the kitchen table. Marge brought over 2 glasses of lemonade, silent but beaming. The papers were thick, notarized, registered, recorded, irreversible. "You sign here," Dan said, pointing to the bottom right. "And it's yours. In full." Irene signed with the same pen she'd used to write Then she reached into a drawer and pulled out another envelope. "Her will. I want it amended," she told Dan. "Everything goes to Sophie. The house, the land, the trust. No loopholes." Dan adjusted his glasses. "You sure? She's the only one who saw what was disappearing." Sophie looked up from across the table, eyes wide. "Grandma." Irene held up a hand. "This isn't a gift, it's a charge. Keep it rooted." "I will." Dan collected the papers, satisfied. "It's done. Not in progress, not pending. Done." That evening, as twilight swallowed the last gold light over the trees, a courier walked up the driveway, carrying an envelope in a translucent sleeve. Inside, a formal warning issued by the sheriff's office. Notice of trespass prohibition subject. Ethan Whitaker. Effective immediately. Location, 4198, Whitaker Farm Road, Columbus, OH. Signed. Filed, enforced. Ethan wouldn't just be locked out of the will. Now he was legally banned from stepping foot on the land he once mocked his mother for just holding on to out of habit. Legacy rewritten, in ink that wouldn't smudge. The porch light cast a warm glow over the front steps as the last of the guests arrived, the familiar crunch of gravel under tires giving way to the hum of easy laughter and screamed door hinges. Inside the farmhouse, the air smelled of rosemary, brown butter, and peach cobbler cooling on the sideboard. Irene stood at the stove, ladling stew into a serving bowl with the same hands that once folded Ethan's baby clothes. She wore a soft plum cardigan, Camille had knit the year before she passed. Around her neck the Whitaker locket, now closed, now hers again. The table was dressed in a faded cotton runner stitched with initials from generations ago. Real cloth napkins, Camille's china with the hairline cracks, and wide mason jars instead of wine glasses. No branding, no pretense, just place cards. Sophie had designed them herself, heavy cream cardstock, brush ink names with little watercolored sketches in the corners, a robin, a walnut leaf, a sketch of the old barn. The card at the head of the table simply read Matriarch. Irene touched it briefly before taking her seat. She didn't cry, but something about it stitched a seam back together that had been unraveling for years. Marge arrived with a pie still warm in the tin, calling out through the door, "I brought the backup dessert, just in case you served anything store-bought." Dan followed behind her with a six-pack of root beer and a sealed envelope under one arm. His tie was crooked, it made him look younger. As they passed around bowls and bread, the stories came, not as performances, but as memory pulling gently on the thread of time. Leonard told the tale of the plumbing disaster in '89. Marge swore she once saw Camille chase a raccoon out with a frying pan. Dan recited the names of the property's previous owners backward, like it was trivia. Sophie sketched all of it quietly from the corner, eyes flicking between candlelight and memory. No one asked where Ethan or Madeline were. They weren't invited. Out on the road, headlights slowed to a crawl. A black SUV idled at the edge of the drive, just far enough to stay unspoken. Inside, Ethan's hands were tight on the steering wheel, jaw clenched. Madeline scrolled through her phone, the blue light casting ghost shadows across her cheekbones. "They're pretending we don't exist," she muttered. Ethan didn't answer. Back in the farmhouse, Irene lit a match and ignited the final taper candle. Its flame danced quietly, catching the gold rim of Camille's favorite dessert plate, now holding a thick wedge of peach cobbler made from last year's frozen harvest. She poured coffee into mismatched mugs, passing them hand to hand. No speeches, no selfies, just clinks of silverware and real laughter, the kind that doesn't need a performance cue. Dan leaned back in his chair, the firelight catching the curve of his smile. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a bound document, its seal visible even in the dim. He set it beside Irene's plate. No announcement, just a quiet offering. She looked down at the cover. Final deed, Whitaker Estate Trust. Fully recorded, fully executed. No contest, no reversal. Her fingers brushed over it slowly. Her name, Irene C. Whitaker, stamped in embossed type. She didn't speak, just reached for her coffee and took a sip, steady and slow. The laughter swelled around her, rising like warmth from old floorboards. Outside, the SUV idled for another minute, then pulled away, swallowed by the road and a future no longer theirs. Inside, the table remained full, not just with food, but with presence. Camille would have liked this. Not for the formality, but for the fact that everything Irene set down had weight, had soul, had earned its place. The storage unit door groaned open like a throat clearing. After years of silence, dust bloomed into the air, thick and musty, a scent of forgotten holidays and attic corners. Irene stepped inside slowly, her boots crunching over a stray carpet tack. The unit's fluorescent bulb flickered overhead, casting long, shaky shadows across stacks of boxes marked in black Sharpie, linen seasonal, books iPhoto, photo frames old. These were the last things of hers. Ethan hadn't thrown out, just shoved away. Out of sight, out of dignity. Sophie stood beside her, sleeves pushed up, ponytail high. "Want to start at the back?" "No," Irene said. "We start with what they tried to bury first." She pointed to a large crushed banker's box labeled basement, misc taped hastily and buckling at the corners. Together they dragged it into the light. Inside, beneath layers of brittle tissue paper, were damp-smelling photo albums, half a stack of yellowing receipts, and a small leather-bound ledger book. The kind Camille used to log every dollar spent down to the nickel. Irene opened the first album. A loose Polaroid slipped out. Camille in a wide-brim hat. Ethan riding a tricycle in the gravel drive behind her. Camille was mid-laugh. Irene remembered the sound. Sophie gently pulled the album toward herself and began separating the pages with a soft artist's cloth. I used to think these were just old pictures, she said. Now I know they're evidence. Irene smiled faintly. They thought I was hoarding, but I was archiving. They worked in silence for an hour. Every item felt like uncovering a chapter no one had cared to reread. Sophie opened a small shoebox labeled Misc letters and gasped softly. Inside were folded notes from Camille to Irene, grocery lists, scribbled poems, even one with a hastily drawn floor plan for a kitchen remodel that never happened. Between them, a receipt for roof patching in Irene's name, dated 2002. Sophie held it up. Think Dan needs this. Irene took it, studying the faded ink. He'll love it. 2 boxes over, Sophie found another, newer, cleaner. Inside, perfectly stacked folders with spreadsheet printouts, notes in Irene's handwriting, and clipped receipts. On the side, a label. Archive. Trust records. Did you do this for the case? Sophie asked. No, Irene said, surprised even by her own voice. I did it before Camille died, just in case someone ever questioned who really showed up. Outside the unit, the sun had begun to slide low behind the trees, casting the long cement corridor in a burnt orange haze. Marge arrived with her tablet, 2 coffees, and a portable scanner strapped around her neck. Well? She asked, lifting her sunglasses. Are we ready to digitize the skeletons? Irene handed her the archive box. Only if we file the bones alphabetically. Marge set up on a folding table they dragged out from behind a stack of paint cans. Within minutes, she had the scanner humming, feeding in old records, property statements, checks, and photos. Sophie snapped high-res photos of handwritten entries for redundancy. Irene sipped her coffee, watching it all with a stillness that looked like rest but wasn't. Her phone buzzed. Voicemail, one new message. From Ethan. She clicked play. His voice, once so smug, now sounded hollow, like a man running out of doors to slam. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mom. You won. We get it. But you don't have to drag this out. You don't have to make it worse than it already is. She listened, silently. When it ended, she didn't delete it. She just tucked the phone away. You okay? Sophie asked. Irene nodded. You know what happens when someone says you're making it harder? What? It means you're finally not making it easy for them. That night, across town, Madeline opened her mailbox to find a thick envelope from the county. Inside, formal notice of inheritance reallocation effective immediately heir. Removed by executor successor beneficiary. Sophie Whitaker. Her hands trembled just slightly as she read it. Twice. The legacy she tried to erase had returned the favor. The post office in rural Franklin County was small enough that Irene didn't need to wait in line. She stepped up to the counter, handed over the 2 thick manila envelopes, and quietly said, certified, signature required. The clerk, a man in his 40s with a coffee-stained tie and an Ohio State keychain, scanned the barcodes and asked, anything fragile? Only their ego. Irene replied. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The envelopes were already weighted just right, not with emotion, but consequence. Inside the final trust structure, officially registered and signed. Irene named herself as current sole property owner. Sophie Whitaker as successor heir and beneficiary to the entire estate, including land, trust accounts, and preservation titles. No options. No appeals. The second envelope held a copy of the original will, the one Ethan had so carefully filed on his own terms, back when he thought the house was his by blood and entitlement. Attached to it was a yellow sticky note in Irene's blocky handwriting, in case you forgot. Ethan received his envelope on a Thursday afternoon. He tore it open in the driveway, the sun blinding off the windshield of the Tesla he could no longer justify financing. His hands trembled as he skimmed the legal phrases. Final trust declaration. Sole beneficiary amended. Irrevocable succession structure. He didn't finish it. He crumpled the letter and hurled it across the passenger seat like it had burned him. The envelope flopped open on the floor mat, its contents spilling. The sticky note stuck to his shoe when he stepped out. Madeline's copy arrived a few hours later. She opened hers in the kitchen, lit by white marble counters and polished steel that she no longer had a stake in. Her eyes narrowed at the language, scanning for loopholes. There were none. Every line had Dan Coulter's name behind it. She dialed Dan's number with tight fingers. It rang 4 times and went straight to voicemail. "Dan, it's Madeline," she said through clenched teeth. "I'd appreciate a call back. We're willing to renegotiate. This has gone too far." She didn't leave her number. He didn't need it. He also wouldn't call. Back at the farmhouse, Irene watered the basil plant on the windowsill, humming faintly. Sophie came in holding her own copy of the will, not the one addressed to her but the duplicate Irene had given her quietly. "I want you to have it," Irene had said. "Not because it's legal, because it's real." Now Sophie stood in her upstairs studio, surrounded by sketches of the land, of Camille laughing, of Irene standing with the mailbox. She slid the document into a simple black frame, centered it on the wall above her desk, and stepped back. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like home. That evening, as the sun fell behind the walnut tree, Marge brought over a fresh pie and a question. "You ever feel bad?" she asked, setting the dish on the kitchen table and easing herself into a chair. Irene poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her. "Only when they had a choice." Marge raised a brow. "And now? Now I don't feel anything at all." They sat in silence, the kind only possible between people who've known each other through every kind of storm. From the living room, Sophie's music drifted softly, a bluesy guitar track that Camille would have played on vinyl if she were still around. The mail hadn't come yet. It arrived just before dusk, the carrier placing the envelope gently in the slot of the new black mailbox. Sophie retrieved it, walked it in without a word, and handed it to Irene. The seal bore the insignia of the Franklin County Historical Commission. Irene opened it slowly. Inside, a crisp certificate and a letter. "Dear Miss Whitaker, it is our honor to award you the Historic Family Stewardship Recognition for the Whitaker property, preserving not only the structure but the soul of one of Ohio's longest-standing family legacies." The certificate was dated and signed. No protest, no question. Irene stared at it for a long moment. "I didn't do this for recognition," she murmured. "I know," Sophie said from behind her, "but it still found you." The walnut tree stood wide and still, roots buried deep in the same dirt Irene's father turned with a spade in 1953. Its limbs stretched like open arms across the field's edge, catching the last of autumn's golden leaves that refused to fall all at once. Irene ran a hand over the newly installed bench at its base, smooth, hand-sanded and honey-stained. It smelled of fresh lacquer and morning rain. The engraving along the backrest, etched deep into the wood, read, "For those who kept the home alive." She sat slowly, joints stiff but heart unshakable. The breeze stirred the hem of her sweater. She could hear birds in the corn stubble, the distant whistle of a train crossing in town. Everything felt quieter now, not empty, settled. Behind her, laughter echoed faintly from the barn. Sophie had turned the south wall into her canvas. Bright strokes of cobalt and crimson framed a mural nearly 10 feet tall, a living portrait of Irene's journey. On one side, a woman in silhouette clutching papers against the wind. In the middle, the farmhouse itself, surrounded by fields and lines of text in Sophie's handwriting, snippets of things Irene had said, lived, or refused to let go of. On the far right, a young girl planting seeds beneath Camille's watchful gaze, ghost-like but solid. Marge stood with her arms crossed, teary-eyed and beaming. "She nailed the colors," she whispered. "That sky feels like the one right before a storm clears." A local news photographer, tipped off by the county's Heritage Committee, stepped back to snap a wide shot. His lens caught the sunlight breaking through the trees, the shadows falling just right. He didn't need to pose anything. It was already perfect. That evening, Madeline sat in her silent kitchen, sipping a Pinot she couldn't taste. Her heels were kicked off at the door. The television murmured from the living room where the 6 o'clock news began its community segment. And in Franklin County today, a tribute to generations past and present as a newly restored farm earns landmark status. Sophie Whitaker, 18, unveils a barn mural honoring her grandmother, Irene Whitaker, recipient of the Historic Family Stewardship Award. The camera cut to Irene, seated on the bench beneath the walnut tree, smiling faintly, sun crowning her silver hair. Then to the mural, proud, unapologetic, alive. Madeline dropped the wine glass onto the rug. It didn't shatter. It just rolled away. At 9:42 p.m., Irene heard tires on gravel. She didn't rise. She was on the porch in her rocking chair, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, a quilt draped over her knees. Ethan stepped into the lamplight, not dressed for confrontation, just jeans, an old jacket, and something in his face that looked closer to surrender than apology. He stopped at the foot of the porch, looked up. "I saw it on the news," he said. "I know." He swallowed hard. "It's beautiful. Sophie's painting. She did it for the ones who remember." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I was just a kid, Mom. I didn't know what it took to keep it all going." "No," she said, her voice even. "But you knew what it meant when you tried to take it." He looked away, blinking fast. "So what happens now?" Irene set the mug down and leaned forward, eyes level. "Now I rest," she said. "You deal." He nodded once slowly, then again, like it finally reached the place it needed to. He turned and walked back to his car, this time without slamming a door or spinning gravel. Just silence, just truth. The next morning, Dan walked up the drive, with a sealed envelope in one hand and an old leather briefcase in the other. His coat flapped behind him in the wind. On the porch, Irene was already waiting. He handed her the envelope. "It's done." She opened it carefully. Inside, final trust certification, Whitaker estate status, irrevocable, multi-generational succession, primary owner, Irene C. Whitaker, sole heir. Sophie Whitaker, effective immediately. No contest. No loopholes. No re-entry. Dan exhaled. "It's airtight." Irene looked out across the land. Camille's garden, her father's walnut tree, Sophie's mural shining in the distance. "Airtight's good," she said. "Roots don't grow in chaos." The front parlor used to be where Madeline hosted vision meetings, where faux wood blinds stayed drawn and trendy blueprints were spread across the antique table like conquest maps. Irene remembered walking past that room once and hearing Madeline say, "This space would be perfect for a tasting lounge, maybe a podcast corner." Now, the only thing it tasted like was permanence. The early afternoon light poured in through uncovered windows, turning the oak floors to gold. Irene stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled, watching Sophie stretch canvas paper across a wide drafting board. Her hair was tied up in a messy knot, graphite smudges across her knuckles. A second-hand easel leaned against the far wall, on it an unfinished painting of Camille's hands sewing quilt corners, vibrant and alive even in mid-stroke. The room had changed completely. They'd painted the walls a soft bone white, letting the light do most of the work. Framed sketches lined the east wall, some of the house, others of Sophie's memories, her grandfather's rocking chair, Irene with her back to a sunrise, the walnut tree in winter. On a reclaimed bookshelf, Irene's old library books sat neatly stacked next to her sister's apron, still with a faint scent of time. Camille's sewing box was there too, closed but present. On the top shelf sat the family's original crest, a carved wood emblem her father had chiseled in his 20s. It had been boxed up for years, nearly lost under Madeline's new farmhouse minimalism. But now it hung again, nailed directly into the beam above the mantel. "Still fits," Irene said, running a finger across the grain of the old frame. "It never stopped fitting," Sophie replied, stepping back to examine the mural in progress. "They just wanted it to feel out of place." Irene pulled a worn hand-stitched quilt from the cedar chest and draped it over the love seat in the corner. The same one Camille used to nap on when the house was too loud and life too heavy. The scent of lavender and cedar oil lifted into the air, soft and clean. Sophie paused in the center of the room, charcoal stick in hand, and turned to face her grandmother. "Why didn't you give up?" Irene blinked. "What?" Sophie gestured around the room, to the paintings, to the saved things, to the cracked floorboard they'd decided to keep exposed, because history shouldn't be hidden under vinyl. "This place, everything. They tried so hard to erase you, to push you out, and still you kept showing up." Irene walked over and eased herself onto the love seat. "Because I had to leave something that couldn't be taken back," she said simply. "Money disappears, houses rot, but truth plants itself, and if you tend it right, it'll survive anything." Sophie sat beside her, silent. For a while the only sound was the tick of the hallway clock and the faint brush of leaves outside. Then a knock at the door. Marge appeared with a pie in hand and flour on her jeans. "Am I early?" she asked. "Nope," Irene said. "You're right on time." Marge looked around the room, eyes wide, slow smile forming as she took in the sketches, the apron, the quilt. "Well, look at that. You turned the war room into a sanctuary." Irene stood to take the pie. "That's because it was never a war room, they just made it one." Marge grinned. "You ever gonna slow down?" "Eventually," Irene said. "But not while there's still clutter to unbury and roots to water." They laughed softly. Sophie rose and moved to the window, brushing aside the gauzy curtain. The sun had dipped just low enough to set the field ablaze in amber light. She looked out, not at the horizon, but at the porch swing, the barn, the walnut tree. All still here, all claimed. She turned back to her grandmother, voice quiet but steady. "Can I call this home now?" Irene didn't answer right away. She simply walked over and took Sophie's hand, pressing it to the wall near the old crest. "Only if you promise never to call it perfect," she said. "Just yours." The morning rolled in slow and golden, the kind of sunrise that didn't rush but unfurled, like the land itself had exhaled overnight. Irene sat on the porch swing, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee, the steam curling upward into the crisp Ohio air. The view hadn't changed. Still rows of frost-glazed fields. Still the walnut tree standing sentinel at the edge of the yard. Still the barn, now kissed with a bright swath of Sophie's mural, a flash of cobalt where there used to be blank gray siding. What had changed was everything else. Her name was on the title. On the mailbox. On the mailbox. On the trust papers filed in airtight ink at the Franklin County Courthouse. Not his. Not hers. Just Irene C. Whitaker, etched into record. Ownership hadn't made the world shinier, but it had made it clear. From the edge of the porch, Sophie crouched with a sketch pad balanced on her knee, eyes flicking between her grandmother and the morning light. "Don't move," she murmured. Irene didn't. She just lifted the mug to her lips, let the coffee warm her chest, and settled back into the rhythm of the swing. Her cardigan brushed against the worn armrest. Camille had mended that sleeve once, a tiny cross-stitch repair that held stronger than any factory seam. Sophie's charcoal scratched across the paper. "You always sit like that," she said. "Straight spine, but soft shoulders. Like you're calm but still ready to stand." "I am," Irene replied. A hawk cried in the distance. Wind passed through the corn stubble, soft and swishing. A tractor engine coughed to life far off near the north field. Even though the season was done, there were still chores to finish, roots to turn, things to fix, but for once it wasn't all on her shoulders. A chime sounded from Sophie's phone on the railing. She glanced at it, then looked up, surprised. "Grandma. It's a message from the Columbus Women's Heritage Collective." Irene raised a brow. "That's a mouthful. They're asking if you'd speak on a panel. Themes: second chances, land, legacy, and women who refuse to leave." Irene snorted into her mug. "And here I thought I was finally off the hook." Sophie grinned. "They're offering an honorarium and gas mileage." That made Irene laugh. Deep, real. "I'll go," she said. "But only if they're serious about not wasting a second chance. Otherwise they'll get a speech about roofing tar and how to prune walnut saplings." Sophie nodded. "That's probably better than what they're expecting." For a moment they just watched the sunrise together. Not saying much, not needing to. Irene didn't talk about Ethan, or Madeline. She didn't have to. Their names were no longer printed on deeds, or sealed into court records. Their cars didn't come down this road anymore. Their calls didn't ring through. They had vanished in all the ways that mattered. What was left was this: the swing, the porch, the girl sketching on the steps, and the woman who had refused to be erased. Behind them, through the parlor window, the original family crest caught the sunlight, and shimmered like it knew it had survived something. On the wall above Sophie's drafting desk, the framed trust papers hung clean and bold. Below it a sticky note: Camille once wrote in jest, still preserved under glass. Do not touch this unless your name is Whitaker, and you mean it. Irene glanced toward the tree line. Just wind. No SUVs. No entitlement pretending to be grief. Nothing but the quiet hum of land reclaimed. Sophie added a final line to her sketch, a faint arc over Irene's shoulder. The curve of sunrise, the shape of resolve. Done, she said, holding it up. Irene looked at it and saw herself. Not younger, not prettier, just real, spined with years, softened by none.
You'll keep this?
Irene asked. I'll keep everything, Sophie said. Irene leaned back. Let the swing rock her once more. They gave me a can of soup, she said softly. I gave them a legacy they'll never taste.